Good morning and most welcome to Heidegger 1332. We will continue where I left off at 1331 with Marks-Tarlow's fractal entanglement between observer and observed. It's a rather lengthy article, so I see how much headway I can do today. I will continue at page 2 of the article. There will be a link to download it from Terry's personal homepage, where there's a lot of articles to be downloaded as well. Let's see here. And it follows the cybernetic revolution. The period following World War II was a time of tremendous intellectual growth in America, emerging from technology developed during the war. Several trends converged to legitimate the scientific merit of psychology, including the birth of cybernetics, the science of information, this new field, spearheaded by the mathematician Norbert Wiener, mushroomed out of the interdisciplinary Macy conferences held yearly between 1946 and 1953. Cybernetics brought a new variant of the metaphor of the mind as mechanism. Roots of this idea extend at least as far back as Renaissance times. When the natural sciences, one by one, split off from philosophy. As more empirical studies began, the heart resembled a pump, the body a machine, and the whole universe ran like a clockwork. Mechanistic metaphors are evident within the psychoanalytic theories of Freud, where, for example, the primitive instincts of drive theory resemble hydraulics of the steam engine. The cybernetic association between mind and machine, made in the mid-20th century, proved a boost to the neurosciences. When neural loops in the brain were modeled as logical chains, the cybernetic association between mind and machine, made in the mid-1920th century, proved a boost to the neurosciences. When neural loops in the brain were modeled as logical chains, mechanistic metaphors also ushered in the cognitivist revolution, as activity in the psyche was likened to information processing in computers. As humanistic thinkers raged against the cold, mechanical, and at times reductionist views being espoused within the Macy conferences protests of a different kind began to surface. Lawrence Kuby, a psychoanalyst and recent retreated from the harder field of neuroscience, stimulated heated discussion among his colleagues by pointing to the problem of reflexivity. Reflexivity, by which an assertion points self-referentially to itself, i.e., what I say no is false. Involves a confluence or melding between observer and observer. Reflexivity is inherent in the very subject matter of psychology. It occurs, for example, whenever researchers use consciousness to understand the nature of consciousness. Narratives to study the narratives of others. Or behavioral repertoires to examine behavior responses in others. Research in psychology is like the mythical Ouroboros, a snake eating its own tail, or tail. Despite every attempt to remain objective by sidestepping subjectivity, even behaviorists can find little relief from the Ouroboros beast of reflexivity. During the Macy conferences, Kuby objected to the early cybernetic agenda of separating information fully from its material embodied sources. the psychoanalyst, protested that within any theory, even inside the hardest of sciences, reflexivity lurks, and the observer lies hidden within the observed. QB claimed that all theories about the outside world say as much about the unconscious of the subject who espouses them as they do about the outside universe as consciously perceived. When it comes to theory and meaning making, no matter what is observed, the observer winds up implicated in the observed. Although QB's protests were dismissed by most of his fellow scientists, his ideas about reflexivity later became ingrained within the history of psychoanalysis. Robert Stolaroff and his colleagues Atwood and Stolaroff, co-founders of intersubjectivity theory, argue that every theory of personality is self-reflexive in that it universalizes the therapist's personal solution to the crisis of his or her own life history. During the early years of the Macy conferences, the notion of science still rested upon the hitherto bedrock foundation of objectivity. By requiring a clear separation of subjects from objects, objectivity was a position that ran contrary to reflexivity. Because early members of the Macy conferences were interested in maintaining science as an explicitly objective enterprise, they choose to ignore QB rather than to revise their own ideas. Instead of including reflexivity within the rubric of science, they dismissed psychoanalysis as science. Generally, during this first wave of cybernetics theory, the problem of reflexivity was successfully avoided by isolating pattern as a separate realm from which all others emanate. When the pattern of information reigns supreme, its material substrate can be first ignored and then eliminated from consideration altogether. According to this view, even without matter, the pattern still matters. by removing information entirely from its material sources. The need for observers was also eliminated. We are left with pattern as a virtual reality with neither observed nor observer. This strategy worked temporarily, but only until the whole enterprise of science began taking a reflexive dive. At the cosmic level of grand-scale events, Einstein's earlier discoveries in physics destroy the previously immutable framework of space and time. The notion of objective observation stretched and deformed. As relativity theory and the subjective stance of observers took center stage. Meanwhile, at the subatomic level of tiny quantum events, another field spawned by Einstein's work, consciousness began pushing its way self-reflexively into the middle. The still controversial Copenhagen interpretation asserted that at the quantum level, the very act of observation is necessary to materialize that which is observed. Even mathematics was not immune from a reflexive fall. In the 1930s, an Austrian mathematician named Kurt Gödel used recursive methods in order to code numbers and then talk about them reflexively at a higher meta level of abstraction. In the process, Gödel proved that no single theory could ever provide a simultaneously consistent and complete foundation to logic. Gödel's assertions annihilated any residual hopes for perfect objectivity within the mathematical underpinnings of science. As reflexivity was seeping into the physical and mathematical sciences, a second wave of cybernetics arose between 1960 and 1985. Spearheaded by Francisco Varela, among others. Information scientists became better prepared to embrace reflexivity. In fact, the very name of this new trend, second-order cybernetics, amounted to the recursive study of observers studying the higher order processes of observation. The observers observe themselves, observing themselves. Postmodernism second-order cybernetics arose within a broad societal sea change known as postmodernism. Over the years, the use of this term has been stretched so far as to encompass practically everything. While being deconstructed so thoroughly as to mean almost nothing. For this reason, I beg to dismiss its broader definition in order to focus upon a single facet, its inherent reflexivity. To symbolize the postmodern imagination, Richard Kearney offers the recursive symbol of two mirrors reflecting one another. He contrasts this with the pre-modern imagination, symbolized by a single mirror in which human creativity reflects God's creation. As well as with the modern imagination, symbolized by a lamp in which human creativity is illuminated from within. Because of its reflexivity, the post-human imagination becomes lost inside an infinite regress of imitations, copies, and simulacra. Within origins deconstructed into dust, the postmodern being is often portrayed as rootless, wandering inside a mechanical artificial desert of reproduction. Within these bleak frontier, on the one hand, the demise of human creativity and originality is decried. On the other hand, there looms the cybernetic threat of machines usurping the very autonomy. Indeed, existence of the humanist creators. in how we became posthuman, English professor Catherine Hales details the threatened deconstruction of embodied existence. She analyzes cyberpunk novels with heroes that evaporate into virtual reality as their consciousness becomes thoroughly enmeshed and encapsulated within machines. The flip side of this futuristic nightmare portrays machines sophisticated enough to take over the evolution of life itself. As artificial intelligence becomes increasingly equipped with emotion, creativity, the capacity to learn, self-repair and self-generate. This sci-fi genre depicts humanoid machines that threaten to extinguish carbon-based evolution as we know it, replacing it with a far superior silicon-based life forms. As post-human boundaries have become more blurred and human beings self-reflexively entangled with facets of their own technological production, lines between observers and observed continue to grow more complex. As reflexivity is integrated more and more consciously into cybernetics, one positive outcome is that the door is thrown open for the scientific study of subjectivity. Consciousness itself has recently regained status as a legitimate and serious object of scientific study. ever sophisticated capacity for functional brain scans now blends first and third person perspectives, while the new field of hyperscanning allows simultaneous brain measurement of two subjectivities in interaction with one another. In the postmodern view, reflexivity is often viewed as a byproduct of modern technology, constructed in the context of particular social and economic trends. Contemporary methods such as neural feedback even allow us to become active observers of our own brain processes. Inarguably, computer-driven cybernetic extensions of our perceptual and conceptual apparatuses do help us to detect, direct, and even create reflexivity with greater ease. Yet I believe that the roots of reflexivity are much deeper and more organic than social and historical trends suggested by postmodernism. I maintain that the discipline of fractal geometry provides evidence that reflexivity is intrinsic not only to human-made productions, but also to nature at large. I will make a little summary and open for questions. So it's going to put a little dot and maybe some coffee. So this was a condensed story of the evolution within neurology and psychoanalysis during the last century, even going into our century. And it goes from a reductionist thinking, the cybernetic revolution, where computers first were imagined, that already happened in the 20s, 30s, and then put into action 40s, 50s, and their influence was enormous in everyday thinking and of course scientific thinking as well. She is a marvel of a writer, Terry. I can't say anything else. It's well put, it's pleasure to read. Any questions, possibly? Could be put now?
Should I take the microphone?
Oh yes, thank you for reminding me.
Yes, so self-reflexity is a problematic term. One banal example is that if somebody hits you on the knee, you become conscious of yourself. But that's also the case with animals. If you hit them on the knee, they reflect. But I was thinking about self-reflexiousness on a higher level. So what makes humans, animals? So where do you draw the line? Okay, if you feel pain in your knee, but I don't see it as a consciousness on a high level. It's a banal view of yourself. So how would you say self-reflexity on a high level? Or is he speaking of such consciousness of a high level? How do you see it?
Yes, it's very good. Well put. Thank you, Kalle. It is on a bit higher logical level, and it's best put in the book Gödel, Escher, Bach, and it was discovered firstly in mathematics and logic by Kurt Gödel, and that is that the algorithms, the axioms and theorems are pointing to themselves, sort of pointing to the observer. This is equal to what happened in quantum mechanics, where all of a sudden, after we've been looking outwards exogenously for millennia, all of a sudden the observer came to the fore as affecting what we thought could not be affected. In the case of quantum mechanics, it was matter. Up to the moment of quantum mechanics, matter was considered to be unaffectable by the observer. And in mathematics, with Kurt Gödel, the observer shadowly makes his presence known in the paradox that he discovered. So yes, it's on a much higher level. And it is remaining a riddle for most people outside quantum mechanics, even to this day. So she is laying now the board for where the game of Fractal will take turns in the next part. I will put a little pause. Anything else?
No.
Little pause there. Fractals help us to advance beyond the cybernetic metaphor of psyche as mechanism to the more organic one of nature, including human nature as fractal. Here, mechanistic means of computer simulation reflexively guide us beyond mechanism. As we circle back to a different kind of origins. For both human and machine, in fractal basis of nature. Before turning to fractal geometry itself, the section to come presents Spencer-Brown and Varela's logical underpinnings for re-entry dynamics. As they are embedded in the very fabric of creation. Contradiction built into the fabric. A great truth is a truth whose opposite is also a great truth. Niels Bohr. When developing his laws of form, mathematician and logician George Spencer Brown tried to specify how we create something from nothing. In consciousness. Spencer-Brown used a two-valued system that consisted only of marked and unmarked states plus two axioms. From these simple bases, he derived a calculus of first distinctions. Although it is commonly believed that George Boole developed the most basic form of logic, Spencer-Brown disagreed. Claiming his own calculus is so primordial as to provide a cradle not only for logic itself, but also for the basic structure of any universe. Within Spencer-Brown's system, one distinguishes marked from unmarked states by attributing value to one state over the other. This act of marking or making a distinction requires an observer we can readily understand this requirement for logic to make a mark, apply a set of axioms, or distinguish truth from falsity. A conscious observer must be present. But how does this process of valuation apply to more primitive levels of a system that supposedly precede logic and even people? Is an observer implicated along with the observed there too? I will return to this issue in my subsequent discussion of fractal geometry. As Spencer Brown progressed with his work, he used basic axioms to derive higher degree equations. But then something strange began to happen. Anomalies appeared, re-entry of equations back into themselves sometimes resulted in paradox. This occurred when marked states became equated with unmarked ones. Spencer Brown offered an interesting interpretation. Rather than to view this as the simultaneous presence of contradictory states, he suggested an alternative. Maybe the system was oscillating between opposite states in time. If so, then self-reflexive acts of re-entry or self-indication would add the dimension of time to that of space already implied by first distinctions. Given enough time, both marked and unmarked can exist in the same space. Neuroscientist and researcher Francisco Varela was intrigued by Spencer Brown's ideas. Especially by his explanation for the dynamics of re-entry. Varela developed a calculus of self-reference to extend Spencer Brown's work. In so doing, he took a bold, if not radical, leap. Rather than to conceptualize re-entry as characterizing higher degree equations only. Varela proposed that re-entry be added at the ground floor as its own term, along with the other two marked and unmarked states. This simple difference made all the difference, as Gregory Bateson might have said. It signaled Varela's departure from Aristotelian logic, which had held an iron grip around philosophers and logicians for millennia. Varela abandoned Aristotle's dichotomous system, where all propositions are either only true or false. Its law of identity, where A can never equal not A. As well as its law of the excluded middle. My note, the LEM for short, end of my note, where the space between truth and falsity is pristinely empty. By adding re-entry as a third term, Varela opened up an infinitely deep Pandora's box of middle ground filled with fuzzy grays, lost identity, and unfathomable complexity. Here not only can something be true and false simultaneously, but even more, Varela actually believed that the existence of autonomy in nature depends upon this contradictory state of affairs. Varela and his mentor Umberto Maturana coined the term autopoiesis to explain how biological systems self-organize. With re-entry dynamics at the core, autopoietic systems embody paradox at their boundaries, expressing their autonomous functioning through remaining functionally closed, yet structurally open. By asserting re-entry as a third value in its own right, Varela agreed with Spencer Brown that self-referential dynamics establish the presence of time. But he went even further to assert that paradox becomes embodied at the most basic level in the very form itself. Whether in organic or inorganic forms, autonomous systems appear supported by inherently contradictory underpinnings. I have to add here compare with form and content, as we earlier mentioned. Remember the canvas, and also remember the in-betweenness between letters inside alphabet, inside an O. Those are disregarded. End of my parenthesis. Imaginary numbers and hidden dimensions. The shortest path between two truths in the real domain passes through the complex domain. Jacques Hadamard. To visualize how paradox becomes embodied into form, it helps to understand imaginary numbers. When Spencer Brown interpreted contradiction as oscillation, he likened his discovery of time to that of the complex number plane. A quote from Varela. When Spencer Brown introduces re-entry and arrives at an expression equivalent to its content, F equals F1, what we call a self-cross. He notes its disconnection with his arithmetic, and thus chooses to interpret it as an imaginary state in the form seen in time as an alteration of the two states of the form. This interpretation is, in my opinion, one of his most outstanding contributions. He succeeds in linking time and description in a most natural fashion. End of quote. This linkage may be even deeper than mere analogy. Imaginary numbers discovered in the 17th century by the Italian mathematician Jerome Cardan. Involve two orthogonal axes, one real and one imaginary. The seemingly impossible square root of -1. As their name suggests, these numbers originally were considered entirely fanciful. Although they kept cropping up in equations of the form x squared equals -1. They were originally believed to have no practical applications. Yet, as often occurs with even the most far out seeming mathematical abstractions, unexpected practical uses are eventually found. Sometimes in the strangest places. For example, non-Euclidean geometry was originally thought impractical because it seems to contradict everyday perception. Yet its rather strange geometry perfectly models the curved space-time of Einstein's equations. Such has been the case for imaginary numbers as well. Generally, within mathematical equations, the square root of -1 represents invisible, extra, or hidden dimensionality. For example, in electrical engineering, it models reversed polarities of alternating currents. In Einstein's famous equation, E equals mc squared, the square root of -1 represents the fourth dimension, time, added to the three customary dimensions of space, length, width, depth, imaginary numbers also crop up in quantum mechanics, where they capture or fail to do so immeasurable non-local aspects of electron behavior known as wave functions. Generally, it appears that those artificially constructed fictions called imaginary numbers keep emerging in the very same reflexive places where the observer is increasingly detectable within the observed. When Einstein revolutionized physics with his work on relativity in the early 20th century, most lay people felt his theory to be beyond their comprehension. Yet Einstein's ideas did find a way to filter down to a segment of the population. Rather than to interpret the fourth dimension narrowly as time, it became fashionable to view this extra dimension more broadly as the interior space-time of imagination, or even consciousness itself. As mentioned, at about the same point in history, consciousness began occupying center stage in quantum mechanics, where what was found at the microscopic level seemed to depend entirely on methods of observation. The Copenhagen interpretation asserts that in order to collapse the quantum waveform from a state of infinite potentiality, where anything is possible, to that of material reality. Where only one possibility is actualized, an observer is required. Here we have observers postulating the necessity of their own observations to bring into existence the phenomena under observation. Quantum mechanics was closing a loop on itself by self-referentially implicating consciousness into the phenomenon under study. While an objectivist nightmare, the zeitgeist seems to have arrived for the recursive inclusion of the observer within the observed. Inside the realm of psychology, a neophyte field devoted entirely to the reflexive enterprise of consciousness, circling back around to examine itself. Imaginary numbers also were coming into play. Carl Jung considered the concept of number highly significant to the psyche. In fact, the Swiss psychiatrist came to view number as the most basic archetype of all. Although unable to unfold many details, Jung conceived of number as providing the basis for a unified stratum, which he termed a psychoid level, where inner and outer, mind and matter meet as one. Mistakenly, Jung called imaginary numbers transcendent ones. and named a corresponding psychological function, the transcendent function, after them. Jung interpreted real and imaginary aspects of the complex plane in terms of the union of conscious and unconscious contents of the psyche. This union for Jung constitutes the essence of individuation. The process by which we each come most fully into ourselves. During individuation, the little self of the conscious ego aligns and balances with the big self. Of the unconscious whole. The known coincides with the unknown. Through lenses of Aurela's recursive dynamics, the individuation process itself can be seen self-reflexively as a lifelong cycle of re-entry. I and my colleagues, Robertson and Coombs, 2002, have described the evolution of consciousness in terms of such cycles. Psychological birth is preceded by the paradoxical union of opposites. Within the unconscious, as we begin our mental life with good and bad, you and me, inside, outside, melded together. In order to make distinctions, nascent consciousness must separate each pole from its opposite. This includes conscious from unconscious elements. And yet, complete psychological evolution requires that we bring together or balance all opposites. Including conscious and unconscious realms into a coincidentia oppositorium, a coincidence of opposites. Marks-Tarlow suggest that all psychological development possesses paradoxical underpinnings. For example, spiritual advancement can be characterized as the use of self-reflection to achieve increasing objectivity. I think that is incredibly important. And you will see later that this is one of the main streams of Marks-Tarlow. Yet to follow a path towards objectivity is to attempt to step outside ourselves and undertake an endeavor in which, by definition, we cannot succeed. For we can never step fully outside ourselves. What is more, most spiritual paths aim towards objectivity involve paradoxically moving in the exact opposite direction, i.e., using methods of meditation to delve yet further inside our own subjectivity. I will put a point and make a little recap here. I made a little illustration here, a graphic symbol for what was discovered in the 1920s, both from quantum mechanics and mathematics. And this is reflexivity, or self-referential. Within the number system, I keenly recommend Gödel, Escher, går det very still? Gödel, Escher, Bach. By Douglas Hofstadter, written in 1979, and it's still a seminal book, I would say, very important. Maybe the best exposure of self-reflexivity. It is a massive volume, and by reading it, you open yourself up to understand that in reality, mathematics and science itself is self-reflexive. And as Douglas Hofstadter said, it cannot be done without going through the work. You slowly, by inch, I would say, you discover a process that at first seems as a paradox. But after a while, the paradox turns into almost an entity. It took, for me as reading the book, 1 year for the entity to form. And that goes to show how deeply embedded inside our way of understanding this knot, so to speak, is. But the knot can be cracked. It takes precision. I would say one of the reasons we do not know there is an observer is lack of precision. If you are as thoroughly as Douglas Hofstadter, the observer cannot, as he usually does, escape. It is I wouldn't call it sloppy, because we are used to this. This is a sort of thinking we grew up with. But exactly when you go through the reiteration of the Gödelian exposure, you notice at the bottom there is a paradox. And this paradox is when I understood the self-reflexive nature of mathematics and of all of existence. This is a base of the foundational thinking of the logic of Spencer as well. He starts out with a paradox. And this was later used by Maturana and Varela. And they have a special idea that life actually stems from this self-reflexivity. They call this tendency autopoiesis. So instead of seeing everything as we usually do in genetics, from a point of nowhere, looking at the evolution of life from a perspective that is impossible. You see here what I mean with the sloppy thinking. Somewhere in the logical line, we do not observe that it should be someone doing the observation. We need to skip that, or we need to be sloppy to a certain extent. And then we can do as it is done today. The majority of biologists have lost the fault they made. They grew up with it. It was apparent in all their surroundings. And the third thing that Douglas Hofstadter points out, it takes a lot of work. It is not easily done. but once it sort of materializes, it is a bit like seeing one's own shadow for the first time. And I think a rather good comparison that I thought of this morning is that the reductionists, I have to include myself into that, because I still have a lot of that material inside of my thinking. But reductionism cannot see the shadows. They can only see the object. So if you look here, this pen, yes, you can see, is casting a shadow. And if you put the thing directly, there is hardly any shadow. And what reductionism is doing is looking directly at the object, and there is no casted shadow. The shadow is the observer. For you who done photography, you always notice that there is a darkness in the photo. And that is you yourself standing in front of the light. And the work that Terry has done is the same. She's slowly gone through the work of Gödel, Escher, Bach. She done her logic. And now I'm still not there. That will be a theme for the next lecture when we go into the fractal geometry. She will show how the observer can be visualized. And as my metaphor with the pen and the shadow, this is possibly even better. You can see the act of the observer in real time, so to speak. And her symbol, I think it's a bit more energetic even than the Necker cube, because it's vivid, and you see that reality comes to the fore exactly in the boundary between what exists and what does not exist. In between these two poles that she so aptly put, we needed in the beginning when we grew up, either as humanity or as individual human beings. We need to have distinctions. Possibly what happens is that we get mesmerized by the distinctions. And in this process, there is a forgetfulness. This is exactly the Heideggerian why question. The forgetfulness makes us not see that where does it come from? Where is the basis? Vergesenheit, I think he calls it. Terry is bringing it out into the open in a very articulate way. And I really liked her history go through, because it is, when you approach this subject, it's good to place yourself in the historicity, the Geschichte that Heidegger will call it. Otherwise you don't have the roots. It will be flying above. You need to get into the development. It's a bit of an epistemological development. Something changes in our understanding, and by going through history, you can sort of archaeologically uncover meaning once more and bring it to the open, and then eco homo or eco ego see the observer. Kalle, maybe.
Yes, Young made the mistake about the imaginary numbers.
Well,
mistake, okay, quotation marks.
He mentioned
them.
He gave them a wrong name, but otherwise I think he captured the whole thing, yes.
And so we have in the past gone through the Indian philosopher Ashish Dalela, who pointed out that even the number 1 is corporal. So you begin with, when you count 1, 2, 3, you begin with your body, so to say. And we forget that.
Your own body, yes.
Yes. So perhaps it's like that also with imaginary numbers, because even imaginary numbers must begin somewhere, or imaginary numbers are the part of autopoiesis, or how does he understand this theory, Marks-Tarlow and imaginary numbers?
Skipping a few paragraphs, my viewpoint, and could be corrected, would be that at the very bottom of autopoiesis, or what autopoiesis is the imaginary numbers, because they have a contradiction in themselves. And as we know, contradiction is necessary for growth. Without contradiction, everything is static, there is no movement, and as Heidegger would say, there is no presencing or becoming. And this I'm looking forward to show Terry's nice illustration. I'm still figuring out how to depict it. Need to be on a screen of some sort. But thank you very much for your patience. Have a very nice morning.
Thank you.
Bye bye.